Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all say how pleased I am to see the Minister back in her place, my neighbour in Norwich. I know you've had a little break. You may have been back before today, but this is the first day that I've been back, so welcome to your place. First of all, I'll start with a question. If your policies are unpopular with most voters, and if your own party's demographics are shrinking, what do? Do you change your policy so your party's platform is more appealing to more voters, or do you make it harder for people to vote? Well, I think on reading this bill, we now have this government's answer. Mr Deputy Speaker, such is the extent of the crisis of democracy. There is truly no shortage of issues that this elections bill could have addressed. Our first past the post electoral system already means that millions of people's votes are wasted. When the House of Commons and the House of Lords are taken together as our legislature, half of our legislators aren't elected. We don't even have a constitution that is publicly accessible or which has public consent. This bill does nothing about any of these issues or the many more real problems in our elections and our democracy. Instead, this government is pouring oil on the bonfire of democracy that is taking place not just in the UK, but across the world. When public confidence in the running of elections is at its highest since 2012, we're left to ponder the obvious question: in whose interests is this legislation actually serving? It certainly isn't the interests of the estimated 2.1 million people who will be put at risk of being excluded from voting because they don't have recognisable photo ID. Nor does it serve the interests of working people and civil society. Their right to freedom of expression in elections through trade unions and campaigning will be hamstrung by punitive red tape and put at risk through the government's control of the Electoral Commission. Now, I think it's pretty clear. The beneficiaries of this legislation are this government and their vested interests. It's this government that benefits from the disproportionate exclusion of the very voters hit hardest by their policies. It's the wealthy tax exiles, not members of the public, who will benefit from rules that will enable overseas electors to influence parties and elections through donations. But as members of the benches opposite have even noted, the most cynical aspect of this legislation is, of course, the phantom problem of voter fraud that has been summoned by this government to create a smokescreen of naked self-interest. I will give around that point.
Well, he says that voter fraud is not an issue, and yet in my constituency during a by-election less than a month ago, over 30 pre-filled-in voting ballots were found dumped in a bin in a church in my community of Rutland and Melton, perhaps not normally considered the hotspot of voter fraud. So I'd ask him, if there's not voter fraud going on, then why are we having to currently investigate ballots such as that being found around our country?
So it's a fair point, and let me retort with an alternative statistic for you. There were 34 allegations of impersonation in 2019, the 2019 general election. That was out of 58 million votes. Now, I took my calculator, and that works out that there was 0.0000058% fraud in the last election. So you have produced a piece of legislation straight out of the far-right playbook from the United States, which I will come on to in a minute, to look for a problem that does not exist. So let me make some progress, and I will take more points in a second. I will in a second. I'll just conclude by saying that this tactic is drawn straight from the authoritarian playbook of racist American legislators. Their voter suppression laws have been and are being used to reinstate Jim Crow-era mass disenfranchisement via the back door. Now, to quote the Southern Poverty Law Centre, who've commented on this legislation, the real reason these laws are passed is to suppress the vote, and that is, in fact, what happens. Mr Deputy Speaker, we have a crisis of democracy precisely because established institutions have failed to represent the public as a whole, failed to challenge economic self-interest in favour of the common good. The truth is, and this government knows, its ideology of destructive and unequal growth fuelled by oil and gas is not shared by the British public. Even the super wealthy see the uninhabitable world this system is creating. They choose to flee to private islands or hideouts in vast compounds in the depths of New Zealand and elsewhere. Therefore, this legislation, along with the protest ban and the attacks on the independent judiciary and human rights, is a buttress against the public. Authoritarian control is being shored up because this government knows it cannot win public consent freely and fairly for policies that will continue to impose poverty on an ever greater number of people so that wealth can be extracted for a few. You sit there looking incredulous, and yet that is what your politics and your policies do day in and day out. My question to members, I will take the point. I will take the input.
Thank the honourable member for being so generous with this time. I was just wondering if the honourable member was aware that actually voter ID is very common in other countries. You said that it's a racist policy to bring back Jim Crow laws in the US. Are you aware that the world's most successful multiracial democracy uses voter ID, Canada, as well as highly respected democracies such as Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Italy, France? They all use voter ID.
Just before answers that, can I just remind everybody, please, on all sides, do not refer to you, because that's me. And I have no views on this matter, as you know. Clive Lewis.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I think the honourable member will also know that many of the countries he mentioned already have ID cards fully in use by their population. And as you well know, we don't have them here, unless the party opposite is suggesting that we have a national ID scheme. I know you're talking about the regional ID scheme, but actually, if you're talking about a national ID scheme, fine, make that comparison. But I don't believe you are, so I don't believe that's a fair comparison. So I will conclude by saying, my question to members opposite is this: how comfortable are they with a government front bench that is eroding the fabric of our fragile democracy? And when will they speak up and express misgivings, like the Right Honourable Member for Houghton, Price and Howden, about not just its fleeting, rocky relationship with the truth, but also with democracy? Choose soon, because history will not judge your silence well.